It's clear that the narrative about the virus is being carefully managed globally to minimize the impact on global sentiment and markets. Authorities are aware of the global economy's extreme fragility, so job number one for authorities everywhere is to scrub the news flow of anything that doesn't support the implicit official narrative. 1. That the virus is only an issue in China and that it's contained outside China. And 2. That the virus will soon be contained in China and global business will quickly return to normal. In pushing this narrative, authorities around the world share the same goal: limit the damage to consumer confidence and markets, because the legitimacy of every regime from Beijing to Washington, D.C. to Nairobi is based on maintaining these economic fictions. 1. That global growth will continue in an unbroken trend in the decades ahead, and 2. That this growth benefits everyone, not just the elites. The critical dynamic is consumer confidence. Consumers can't be allowed to become hesitant or afraid because then they'll stop borrowing, buying, and speculating. Authorities outside China have no more interest in accurate totals being released than Chinese authorities, and so official agencies and the corporate media dutifully parrot the implausibly low Chinese statistics as if they reflected reality. But controlling the narrative is not the same as controlling the virus. The narrative is intangible, but the virus is real. Authorities are betting that controlling the narrative about the virus is equivalent to controlling the actual virus. If everyone believes that only 800 people have succumbed to the virus and that the number of infected people is plummeting, then they'll obediently keep borrowing and buying, and authorities will retain their legitimacy, power, and wealth. But if controlling the narrative fails, then the elite's legitimacy, power, and wealth are at risk. Here's a thought experiment. Cremation generates a chemical plume with a signature that's measurable from low-orbit sensors. Rather than accept implausibly low Chinese claims about the total number that have succumbed to the virus, why not use low-orbit assets to actually measure the chemical signatures of the plumes above Wuhan and then calculate an estimate of the total number being cremated daily? But no one in authority anywhere on the planet wants the real totals to become public, because managed ignorance is bliss. One of the key tactics in controlling any narrative is to withhold data. But no data doesn't mean no virus. So let's think through the implicit narratives as a series of claims and test the plausibility of each of them. Narrative number 1. The virus has been contained in North America. So let's break down the specific claims. Only 19 people in all of North America have the virus, and authorities found every single one of them before they infected anybody else. Is this even remotely plausible? Look, tens of thousands of people traveled from China to North America in January, including numerous direct flights from Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak, before authorities limited flights. Yet, miraculously, only 19 of those thousands of people had contracted the virus, and even more miraculously, not a single one of these asymptomatic carriers unknowingly infected a single passerby before being quarantined. Since U.S. citizens and green card holders and their families are still allowed to fly from China to the U.S. and travel freely once they pass a simple temperature test for fever, the narrative also claims that not a single one of these hundreds of people are asymptomatic carriers. And if any are carriers, they won't infect a single other person while they travel freely around North America. Are these claims even remotely plausible for a highly infectious virus that spreads easily between humans while carriers show no symptoms? So let's imagine a slightly more realistic scenario. A Chinese national who unknowingly carries the virus infects dozens of passers-by in taxis, Uber vehicles, subway cars, restaurants, hotels, etc., before coming down with symptoms of the flu. Since the visitor is concerned about what authorities might do to him and his family if it were discovered that he has the virus, he monitors his symptoms and concludes that since they're the same as a run-of-the-mill flu, then he must not have the virus. He recovers in 10 days, unaware that he's carrying the virus and unknowingly infects dozens of other people. Since roughly 80% of those who contract the virus experience mild symptoms, much like conventional flu, this is a reasonable assumption. This individual had the virus and spread it to dozens of other people while asymptomatic, and authorities don't know because he never went to a doctor or to a hospital, and so he was never tested and he was never quarantined. And then there's this one. The virus will soon be contained in China. Millions of people left Wuhan prior to the lockdown, and since the lockdown was pre-announced, tens of thousands of people hurried out before it took effect. Meanwhile, the lockdown did not include flights leaving Wuhan's airport, so hundreds of flights left for destinations in China and elsewhere in the days between the lockdown announcement and the time when flight restrictions took effect. Some consequential percentage of these millions were asymptomatic carriers, and since these millions of people dispersed throughout China, they undoubtedly infected passers-by who never went to Wuhan. Tracking down everyone from Wuhan won't identify everyone unknowingly infected by a traveler from Wuhan. Screening for fever with thermometers won't identify asymptomatic carriers, so screening isn't going to stop the spread of the virus. Because there appears to be a severe shortage of test kits, the likelihood that every clinic and hospital in China has ample test kits to confirm a diagnosis is near zero, and up to 3 test kits per patient are sometimes necessary because follow-up test results can be positive or negative. So the likelihood that the healthcare system has an accurate count of carriers with symptoms in China is near zero. And since asymptomatic carriers have no reason to be tested, and authorities have no reason to test them, the chances that authorities can magically identify every asymptomatic carrier is also near zero. And then there's the claim that the virus will soon be controlled in China. Is that even remotely plausible for a highly contagious virus that spreads easily between humans while carriers show no symptoms? You see, controlling the narrative doesn't mean you're controlling the virus. And so the gulf that exists between happy story narratives and the real world is widening to the breaking point. Like, share, and subscribe. Thank you. This is Nancy Morgan Hart for Headlines with a Voice.